Welcome everybody to this panel which discusses the European Union defense, which has become a hot topic inside the European Union among the EU members who have now frequently voiced their opinions, putting forward new ideas. You know, there are a host of various plans. There is an implementation plan, there is a Commission action plan, there is a host of white papers from different EU countries. So there is a myriad of new political papers and I would say new political enthusiasm for the EU defense matters. And Estonia, who is from June the presidency, carries the presidency of the European Union. For us, an important matter is the defense spending. As you know, there is quite a precise pledge of spending inside NATO. We are thinking how the same pledge could be introduced in the EU. Obviously, a lot of problems with that. What has brought about this political enthusiasm? It's clearly to do with Brexit, one of the most skeptical members of the European defense cooperation issues leaving. It's obviously also the election and statements of Donald Trump, the sort of unease of how he actually sees the US role, the transatlantic role of European defense. And also, this has been brought about by the internal kind of fractions and insecurity of the European Union, the desire to find new projects after Brexit, you know, to find new unions, to show that the Rome Declaration's idea that we should move to an ever closer union can still be worked out. And defense sort of looks as a, quote unquote, an easy matter in that respect, which is of course a mistake. And I'm very worried that by providing such a high political profile, such an impressive chapeau to this issue, we are actually harming the actual projects, and we are occasionally also creating a situation whereby our friends, for instance, the United States, cannot quite grasp what do we mean with this European defense? What do we mean with the European Defense Union? They might misinterpret it, especially since the US has now an administration which is very focused on symbols, punchlines, things like that. So I think this is a challenge. Some of the limitations of European Union defense cooperation are still there. NATO-EU roles have not been settled. There are clear differences in political and military culture. There is a lack of assets, and the question is also in added value of that project. We have an impressive panel today to discuss all these issues from, what is it, left, from right to left. It's Rose Gottemoeller, NATO's Deputy Secretary General, a long time Undersecretary in the State Department, and of course, notably, head of the US delegation in the negotiations with Russia on START Treaty, the so-called New START. And then we have Nathalie Tocci, my top analyst, director of the Italian Institute of Foreign Affairs, and also an advisor to Federica Mogherini, whom we saw here, we had a pleasure to see here yesterday. Reinhard Brandl, member of the Bundestag and member of the Defense Committee of Bundestag, and Etienne Durand from the French Defense Ministry, but also a former and still a very well-known analyst on security matters. So, let's get started, and the first question is to you, Rose, which is, do you feel that the roles of NATO and the European Union in defense matters are now clearer than they were, say, even a year ago, with this new political spirit? And also, I would like you to distinguish between the political statements on that matter and on the actual real stuff, which can be made, which we can actually see and touch.
Whether anything is actually happening.
Yes.
All right.
Please.
Gladly. I was very amused, actually, by the title of this panel, which is More EU, Less NATO, ? And what I wanted to start out saying is I think we need more EU, more NATO, and more EU-NATO. We need all of that at this moment in Europe's history as we're facing so many challenges, not only from a newly aggressive Russia, but also from the threats of violent extremism, the terrorism that emanates from that. So we need more of all three, and that was the first and clear message I wanted to deliver. I've only been in this job 8 months, but in these 8 months, I have seen already an enormous sea change in how NATO and EU cooperate to deliver real stuff. Many of you are familiar with the ministerial agreement that was reached in December to bring together EU and NATO working on a famous 42 proposals. And it was hard work to really get the two organizations, and there was a lot of headbutting that went on, believe me. Nathalie can talk more about this, to get to those 42 proposals. And then the big question was, well, these institutions, and Jüri, you mentioned this right from the outset, these two institutions have so many cultural differences, will they be able to actually come together to begin to implement? And in now the almost 6 months since December, I can tell you that yes, implementation is going forward. We are seeing real projects begin to emerge out of the famous 42 proposals. Work is going on, and the most important thing, I think, is that the two institutions have begun to work together a lot more pragmatically and smoothly than they had historically. In other words, some of those cultural differences, there's still, plenty of headbutting that goes on in any bureaucratic encounter. You've got, priorities and interests to meld together. But I would say that the two staffs are working together very, very well. And in terms of pragmatic stuff that you'll see emerging, I'm particularly keen that in the realm of projecting stability to some of our major partners, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Moldova, Tunisia are the three top examples. There are actually very, very pragmatic projects that are emerging to help work together to project stability in those regions and to those priority countries. So yes, stuff is happening.
Excellent. Do you believe that, I make one follow-up question. Do you believe that among the political decision makers, there is enough understanding that it's not only important to have NATO and the EU work together, but it takes a political effort to actually achieve that? I cannot imagine that if the US president meets President Erdogan, one item in his agenda would be, hey, let's discuss in detail NATO-EU cooperation. I don't think it will ever happen. So there is this challenge, of the kind of official community being very much attached to this issue, but the political community living in a totally different world. Would you say that's the risk?
I would worry about that, Jüri, if I wasn't continuing to see attention and strong attention at the political level. I mentioned the ministerial meeting in February. We are approaching more ministerial interactions in June and then into the fall. Defense ministers will be meeting in June. And there will be attention at every step along the way to EU-NATO cooperation. So I think the attention is there, and it has actually sent a strong message to the implementers. It's sent a strong message to the working levels in both NATO and EU that we have got to accomplish implementation here.
Thank you. Nathalie, you have written or you have drafted the global strategy, and I would have the following question. It's clear that there are a lot of issues when it comes to, working with partners, training, but also working on issues of internal stability, resilience of EU countries. This is all security writ large. But I would ask about defense, about the hard-nosed defense. And again, in very realistic terms, what do you think we could actually achieve in the framework of the rather grand philosophy of global strategy in that area? Please.
I mean, I would say that a train is leaving the station. Now, for the sake of argument, let's call it the European Security and Defence train is leaving the station. There are various stops along the way. We don't quite know what the end point is. Let's say stop number one. Stop number one, it's basically one in which we know what we say our level of ambition is. We know that as we currently stand, it's difficult to actually fulfill it. In order to fulfill it, you need to move towards far more systematic defense cooperation. We've been talking about defense cooperation for a very long time, and it has not happened. So what is the missing bit? What's the trick that's missing? Well, the trick that's missing is obviously there are not sufficient incentives for it to happen. So how can the European Union set up incentives, which include financial incentives, for member states to actually cooperate more and more systematically? So that's, if you like, stage one. And I think this is something that is in the pipeline, and I think and hope it is something that is achievable in the course of the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Stage one. What does stage one allow you to do and move towards? I would say it allows you to move towards a second stage in which you fulfill particularly the, if you like, first and second sort of objectives of your level of ambition, which is, well, what we already achieve is the capacity building bit of it. So the capacity building of partners in their security and defense apparatuses. So that is something that we already do and we can do more of, but it's not a hugely impossible task. What we are far less able to do is to actually do crisis management. And here I'm obviously talking about external crisis management. Now, if we move towards more systematic defense cooperation and therefore require more and better capabilities, presumably we're going to be in a position to do external crisis management more effectively. Now that, if we were to stop there, in my view, would be hugely problematic. I think it's obvious when one sits in this part of the world, but frankly speaking, also when one sits in other quarters of Europe. I think it's very difficult to sell European security and defense unless it's actually shown to directly impact positively upon the security of European citizens at home. Now, here we start getting into more complicated sort of terrain. Because, as we know, on the one hand, the common security and defense policy explicitly states that one cannot act internally within the European Union. In the global strategy, we kind of begin to fudge it a bit. We start talking about protection. But obviously, there are all sorts of concerns here. There are concerns amongst those member states, particularly some of the neutral member states that are worried about the EU doing internal stuff, not all of the neutral member states. There are some of the member states that have a particular eye of regard for NATO that worried that protection will end up meaning territorial defense, which of course it will not. So there is a debate to be had, but I think my point here is that when it comes to European defense, the sky is not the limit, the treaty is the limit. The treaty does actually provide for the progressive framing of a common defense policy, which could eventually lead to common defense. We know that the treaty also talks about solidarity, it talks about mutual assistance. We need to give these terms real meaning. I don't think this is something that is achievable in the next 2 or 3 years, but I think the debate needs to start now, because unless we have that kind of framework in mind, and we need to figure out how there can be a mutually reinforcing role with NATO when it comes to these more internal questions, it will be very difficult to actually sell this project to European citizens.
Thank you. Perhaps a quick follow-up question, which is, again, let's take it in very practical terms. I mean, let's take, for instance, NATO's Libya operation. I mean, come to think of it, it wasn't such a large operation. And the British and the French planes were in the forefront anyway. But the United States provided such crucial enablers, plus the US planes, et cetera, do you believe that there should be a time when the European Union could take an operation like Libya and just conduct it without any US help?
Now, let me make a very personal comment on this.
It is very personal. I'm not proposing any new operations on that.
I actually, I don't think that we are currently in a political situation in which that kind of operation is on the cards. I cannot see it happening. I cannot see a body such as the European Union arriving at consensus, because I'm pretty convinced that this will remain an area in which obviously competence will continue to rest with the member states, in which you're going to have 27 or 26, without, unfortunately, Denmark, on these particular matters, taking a decision to actually intervene in a Libya-type operation. I do think that what is far more likely is that the kind of things, for instance, that France is doing in Africa should be done at European level. Those are the kind of operations which I think are more likely. So I'm basically thinking about sort of counterterrorism type operations, right, as opposed to the sort of big, very sort of focused regime-type operations. I cannot imagine the EU politically being in a condition to actually agree to do that kind of thing at this point in time.
Clear.
And rightly so. Personal.
Reinhard, I would ask you, I mean, quite apart from the beautiful words, the ideological statements, there is also a question of assets, of course. There is a question of money, defense spending. Are we ready to provide even more funds to defense so that there would be assets, which would give us even a theoretical way of discussing what kind of operations would we be taking on? So I would ask you your view and the view of Germany on raising defense spending. I know that President Trump has helpfully pointed out that you owe them a lot of money, as probably do we all. But jokes aside, I mean, where do you believe we should go with defense spending? How far is Germany ready to go, sort of also considering the internal political tensions? Please.
Thank you for your introductory words. There's one driver you didn't mention for defense spending. It's Vladimir Putin. And I could also add perhaps terrorism like Islamic State or the failure of states in Africa. All these developments have changed also the public opinion and the opinion within the German Bundestag when it comes to defense spendings. And we know that we need more defense capabilities within NATO, within the European Union. And we know that it's not a cost-cutting initiative, so that every nation has to contribute and to raise its contribution. And Germany does. This year, we had a plus of 8%. The year before, we had a plus of 4%. And for the next year, we plan at the moment, the elections in September, I know, but the plans are again for 4% raise in defense spendings. And what is, I think, even more important, in the last 4 years, there was a real reverse of trend in German defense spendings. So since the end of the Cold War, the numbers declined, personnel, material, budget, and so. And now we're in a phase where it's raising again. And it's a long-term project, because it's everybody knew that you cannot find, it's more easier to cut than to rise budgets and to find new material, soldiers, and so on. But we are on this track.
Thank you. I would ask you, I mean, I don't know, perhaps it's a sensitive question of sorts, but is it still easier in Germany to speak about the armed forces in the context of sort of international cooperation, NATO, probably particularly European Union? Is it still important to put it all in more internationalist terms, rather than in very sort of national protection terms?
Yes and no. Yes, because every deployment we do is international. There is no single national deployment, and we know that Germany, and neither is one of another state, or there's not Germany and not other state, can provide security for their citizens on their own. So we have to think in coalitions, and we are very active in pushing forward the PESCO initiative, and we are strong in NATO. Framework Nations concept is a NATO initiative. So we are pushing forward on that in this domain. And what have changed also in Germany is 5 years ago, when the Bundeswehr was restructured, everybody had in mind Afghanistan. And this was determined the structure, this kind of deployments determined the structure of the German Bundeswehr. Now, there's this trend had also changed. Now, protection of citizens, protection of the coalition of NATO territory is again in focus, and all our investments oriented towards that aim.
Thank you. And of course, we all here in the Baltic states very much appreciate the German role in the enhanced forward presence deeply, as we do appreciate the French role in the enhanced forward presence. This is a really important part of the defense of Europe. Etienne, I would have the following question to you. France has always been sort of politically pushing the EU common defense efforts. But in actual crisis operations, you are more focused on using the coalition of the willing. You used, during the Paris terrorist attacks, the 42.7 paragraph, which is actually not a collective defense effort, but rather sort of a la carte sort of thing. So, I mean, which is it? Are you following the political line or the pragmatic line here? Please.
Thank you. First, I'd like to say that, of course, we are also in favor of increasing defense spending. I'm from MOD, so if it were a fundraising opportunity, you know. But I return to that because I think it's crucial, jokes apart. You're quite right that I think we've become very pragmatic. To put it in a nutshell, we will take everything that works, everything that delivers. Whether it's from the EU, it's from NATO, it's from so-called minilateral arrangements or bilateral arrangements. I'm thinking of of course, the Lancaster House Agreement that we have with Britain, which is very important and that we certainly hoped and will continue at the bilateral level and to the benefit of European security writ large, not just French and British security. So we'll take everything that works. Now, obviously, the EU has some inborn advantages. It's a well-known point that we've made for a long time. The EU has the full range of tools, development, law enforcement, military capability. So it's maybe probably more the lower part of the spectrum than the higher end of the spectrum, as of now at least. It could evolve in due time. But those are crucial. It's a crucial set of capabilities. Whether you look at Mali, what we call la BSS, la Bande Sahélo-Saharienne, or you look at the Levant today, it's quite obvious that kinetic operations will only take you so far. So you do need to have something in between the kinetic part of the operations and the political arrangement. You need to provide stabilization sometimes for a long period of time. And this is obviously what the EU is best placed to do, and it started in that direction, which is a very good thing. So I don't think we have a coalition approach to that, frankly speaking. Obviously, for counter-terrorism operations in the Sahel, it's mostly done by us, with the help of a few key allies, because you do need specialized capabilities to do that. But those operations would almost be for nothing if they were not accompanied, as they are, by a real stabilization effort in Mali as well, and a real political reconstruction effort. And here the EU really has a lot to contribute. And it's, for us, really a sign of hope that a lot of European countries, including Germany, have now stepped up to the task and have been really involved in that part of the world. For years, we have claimed that it was not just a sort of legacy of French history, and that we had a common interest in preventing that whole region from being destabilized. I think now it's a widely shared preoccupation all over Europe, and it's very important that it is. It does not mean, of course, that there is not a role for NATO. Obviously, there is, especially for collective defense. And that's my final point here. Political will, financial resources, military capabilities, they start at home, at the national level. We should never forget that. So first we need all of us, individually and collectively, to do our homework in terms of defense spending, but not just defense spending. It's not just a question of numbers, it's how well you spend it or not, and improving capabilities, improving readiness. And the more we do at the national level, obviously, the more we will contribute to NATO and EU capabilities and to our overall security. I do not need to come back to the points that were made. The threats we're facing, whether from jihadi terrorism, from resurgent great powers, or actually from proliferation, that we should not forget. It's still going on. Those threats are real. They are much more acute today than they were 10 years ago. And we need, of course, to increase our efforts. But again, it has to start at the national level. And everything then will follow. So my point is really not to use multilateral initiatives as a way to do less at the national level, which might have been the temptation in the past.
Do you believe we should sort of, I think that's what you're saying, we should draw down a little bit the hype part of the defense union thing and be, as you say, more pragmatic perhaps in our, also in our messaging?
French MOD, we are pragmatic. Again, we are very interested in anything that can help us in our own national efforts and ongoing operations, and we are very much, and we are eager to contribute to any solution that actually delivers something, okay? But my point was indeed that we've made a very long list of promises in the past, and not all of them were fulfilled to the level, frankly speaking, of expectations. So there is a danger that we overreach, in a sense. And we should not underestimate the effect that would have on our publics. So everything we do now has to deliver something visible. And Nathalie made that point. I fully agree with that. Otherwise, it will be said that once again, we create vacuums, if you want, which is, by the way, not entirely true. Because there were, for instance, some CSDP or EU operations that did produce stability. And we should not forget what was done in Congo, for instance, some 14 years ago. That was a success. But it is true that we should not, we should be very cautious about creating a sort of big gap between expectations and realities.
Thank you. I think it's very important to sort of focus on the issue that stabilization operations, which you mentioned, are actually very manpower extensive.
Yes.
Because you cannot do it by planes. You actually have to go on the ground. And there is a lack of especially land components. And if Donald Trump will now come to Europe and will make a pitch for more troops in Afghanistan, which is a possibility also for European NATO members, then you see this immediately moving again towards NATO's sort of basket. And potentially, you know, we lose, quote unquote, manpower from the EU basket. So this is an issue of a very small pool of European resources, especially on land, which I think is a problem. But let us open the floor, and please, feel free. Please, on the back there.
Yeah, Christian Munich, German Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks very much for the first round. That was very interesting, very helpful. I have one comment and two questions, I guess. One comment is just highlighting about the German situation. What you may have recognized or not recognized, possibly not, that's why I'm saying this, is for the last round of discussions on 2%, we didn't have a dispute in the German political sphere. Even a minister who tried to test whether 2% could be helpful in the election time refrained from using it afterwards. So there is a broad consensus in the German political sphere that we have to move on. This is just to, you know, about the 2% discussion, which is a bit, we're getting a little bit allergic about. But now, the questions. Etienne, what would it take the French to be, let's be a bit provocative, to be more cooperative, or which are the projects that the French would be willing to sign in the European Union? Because, I mean, so far I see there's a great willingness of France to see more activity from the international organizations, especially from the EU, but what are you willing to chip into this? Second question to Nathalie. I think we have seen quite an evolution of the defense ecosystem in Europe as such, of which CSDP is only a part. And the Lisbon Treaty, which had its innovations or institutional, didn't take into account a larger role, for example, of the Commission on the one hand, and of third parties, which are important in the NATO context, like Norway and others, on the second hand. So if we're talking about the white elephant in the room, which is PESCO, how do we adopt to this? And I'm not talking about changing the treaties, but effectively doing something that helps us in practical terms, in projects, and not in political messaging.
Thank you very much. I don't see a forest of hands, but let's still take a couple of questions. Matt.
Yeah, I'm Matt Bryce, Atlantic Council, Jüri's predecessor here. Great honor for me. At the risk of slightly repeating that question and playing on yours to Etienne, I recall a few years ago an unnamed country, but a NATO major ally, discussion about transatlantic relations, and one of the underlying points was the United States needs to play a greater role. That will make Europe feel more secure. But someone from a Ministry of Defense of one of those NATO countries said no, because the US pulls us into dumb wars like Iraq, okay, but then resists good wars like in Libya. And I'm not quite sure how that ended up being a good war, but that reflected to me a degree of parochialism in defining what our national defense priorities are. And in a way, it sort of reflects populism on a national scale in the national security realm of focusing on one's self and lesser degree of collective security. So for you, the practitioners, especially you, Rose, I mean, what's it like at NATO? Can you comment on that? Do you feel that? I know, yes, we're working together.
It's a big question, Matt.
Thank you.
Okay, let's take one more. Back there.
Yes, I'm İlter Durand from Istanbul Bilgi University. It is remarkable that the word Great Britain has not entered the discussion at all. In view of the pending Brexit, would the title be more appropriately phrased if it says less EU, more NATO, or is this a development which would actually strengthen the willingness of EU to constitute some kind of a defense force? Thank you.
Thank you. So let's start from the other side.
Okay.
Etienne.
Christian, I think for us, the immediate priority is, of course, support for our ongoing operations and making sure that that support is enduring and as effective as possible, and making everyone on board understand that we are really talking stabilization operations that are inherently more difficult, demanding, and possibly costly in terms of lives than pure peacekeeping. I would not, some people now call that high-intensity operations. I would refrain from that. We're not talking high-intensity operations, but we're certainly talking combat operations, or at least stabilization operations in a combat environment that is quite demanding. And everyone has to adjust to that. And I think we are moving in that direction. So actually, we are quite happy. Second, everything that can help support the European defense industry is very good. And we have always been in favor of that. But we have to recognize that there is at least 10 years between the moment you start taking any kind of measures and the moment the effects of those measures will be felt. And that's the defense business. It takes a lot of time, as you know, to develop stuff. Which brings me to my third point, equipment projects. And here again, I mean, we are, of course, in favor of that. But here again, there were some unfortunate precedents, let's call it that, or, you know, problematic precedents. And we have to make sure that everything we do in terms of cooperation, cooperating in developing new equipment, actually is a success, which is entirely feasible. Let's just look back at the 70s and 80s. We did a lot of stuff together, the French and the Germans, and also with the Brits, and those were hugely successful programs. Though it's not written that cooperation will always end in failure. But we have to take in the lessons of what has happened for the past 20 years, and why is it that we've not been as successful as we used to be before. So I'm sorry if I sound very cautious, but if I do, it's because I want that to succeed. And I don't want us to, and I think it's a widely shared perception in French defense circles, we don't want to rush because we want to make sure that we succeed. Whether it's about industrial policy, whether it's about operations, or of course, about new big initiatives. So again, everything we do has to deliver. A final point, if I may, sir, I did mention the UK. And I said that for us, it was quite obvious that Lancaster House Agreement were as important today, and in a sense even more important today now that there is Brexit than they were before. So we are fully intent on keeping the Brits on board, obviously, for defense issues, for defense and security issues, as I think they are, by the way.
I'd ask a quick follow-up, which is, you pointed out the industrial cooperation, and there is this phase also, or this window also in the European Defence Fund, the new defence fund. Why should the big arms firms, why should they accept that kind of cooperation? Or rather, I can broadly understand why they accept it, but why should I accept it? Because I'm sort of paying 2 times for a missile. First, I pay for the development of missile as an EU citizen, and then if my country decides to buy that missile, I pay the 2nd time for that missile. So how do you think this could be organized as a more or less fair development?
It's a very good point, and as you know, it's been a long-time French worry that we pay twice, and we always say that in NATO. So we fully share your point. I think it's important that our publics understand that supporting the defense industry in Europe is not just about defense. There is the conventional wisdom nowadays is that supposedly all comes from Google and Apple and no longer from the defense industry. It's entirely wrong. It is true that there is much more coming from the civilian sector and actually helping us in defense than it used to be the case. But it's still the case that a lot that is going on at the defense industrial level actually has beneficial implications for the European technological base writ large, not just defense. I could, give examples regarding space, regarding a lot of technologies. So as a European citizen, you should do that to support European technological base. It's very important that we do. And some of those projects or technologies that we're working on, you can't rely on the market to develop them because they're not mature enough. So once they are mature enough, they can get into the market. But everything that takes place before, then you do need public money, okay? And you cannot have a clear-cut boundary saying this is defense, so that would be, for instance, bad, which, some certainly thought about in these terms, and that's civilian. There are a lot of domains where actually there is interaction. So that's why we should support the European defense industry. It's not just for defense. It's a larger issue. And it's, if I may, close on that, it's also about European strategic autonomy. If we're not able to, if we don't do the necessary investment in space, in cyber, and in many other domains, we'll be very dependent. And when you look at what other countries are spending, whether friendly, less friendly countries, we have to keep up. It's a race and we have to keep up. It's as simple as that.
Good. Reinhard, please.
I want to get one for a step further and introduce another aspect. So cooperation between industrial companies to produce together defense products. It's a very old concept. We do this for many decades. What we are doing now and what we are pushing forward in Germany is to raise the number of multilateral corporations. It has not only procured together one product, for instance, a plane, but using it together, forming multinational teams or formations that buy a product together, that exercise, and also that are deployed together. For instance, we have one corporation started now with France. We are buying together airplanes, and there's only one base for this airplane, and that's in France. And we are using a Dutch ship for our naval soldiers, and they are on a Dutch command. On the other side, the Dutch armored units are under German command. And that's what we're pushing forward, not only cooperation on the EU and on a NATO level, but let me say the existing armament, merging the existing armies in Europe. And I think that will drive efficiency in defense a lot forward.
There should be a lot of political cooperations also, because you might want to do a military operation, but if the Netherlands doesn't want to do it, that's a big problem. I mean, the same issue is with NATO common assets. How would you actually guarantee you pay a lot for a common asset? How would you actually guarantee that in times of crisis you can 100% use it? And certainly an issue. Nathalie, please.
Three very brief remarks. I mean, the first actually in response to Etienne about the rushing point. I mean, I completely agree with you that one has to get it right, and one has to get it right because particularly if we think about PESCO, it is a one-shot, and therefore you better use it in the right way. Yeah. Having said that, I do think that the political window of opportunity we're in will not necessarily last very long. And therefore, I would tilt more towards the, we need to basically walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to rush, but we need to get it right too. On the very quick point on Brexit and European defence, I think there is a story about fact and a story about fiction behind this. Now, fact. Fact number one, obviously, with Brexit, the European Union loses one of its two member states that actually have full spectrum capabilities and so on and so forth. Fact number two, the United Kingdom has actually, when it comes to European security and defense, made an important contribution, not frankly speaking a massive contribution. fact number 3, the United Kingdom has on specific issues, and I'm thinking about the whole debate over an OHQ, including issues like PESCO, in the past been extremely reluctant. So it has been a break. In my personal view, and here I get onto the fiction, it has not been the main break. But my view is completely irrelevant. What matters is what the perception is, and the broad perception was that the United Kingdom was the main break. And that perception did create a dynamic after the 23rd of June. I don't think we would be in the position we're in now, and we wouldn't be having these kind of conversations, unfortunately, unless that, without that referendum result. It's a very unfortunate situation, but this is the one silver lining there is to it. To answer Christian's question about CSDP and European defense, I mean, I think you really put your finger on the right point here. Because indeed there is a problem. The way in which the common security and defense policy is generally understood does not allow one to do things internally. The thing is that normally when we talk about CSDP, we tend to talk about missions and operations. And indeed, when it comes to missions and operations, there is a very clear treaty limitation. At some point, I think this is something that will have to be relooked into because in a sense, when the debate was framed in those terms, we were living in a very different world. So at some point, that is an issue that will have to be relooked into, but probably this is not the moment to do it. The thing is, and I come back to the issue that this is the political window of opportunity, this is the time in which things are happening. And therefore, the trick is precisely that of talking about European security and defense, or European defense, which kind of goes beyond CSDP, strictly speaking. Particularly when we think about PESCO, when we think about the Coordinated Annual Review on Defense, when we think about the application of the research and capability window. This is not CSDP. This is European defense. At some point, the two will have to obviously come back together, but this is not the time to do it.
Thank you. Rose, please.
Matt Bryza asked the question, what is it like being at NATO? It's wild and it's woolly, but I'm enjoying it very much. But more seriously, you asked me the question about, does the fact that the United States and Europe, they have somewhat different, focal points and priorities, does that drive NATO and EU in different directions as they contemplate taking action in operations? There's no question that the gravitational pull of the United States and NATO is strong. There's just no question about that. And there is no question also that Europe has certain priorities that in many cases are long established with long historical antecedents. No question about that as well. But my perception has been that the processes that are driving the two organizations together, NATO and EU together at the present time, and leading to the cooperation that we talked about from the outset of this panel, are, if there's a conundrum there at this time, it seems to be smoothing out. I'm not exactly sure there is a conundrum, frankly, because over time we do, I think, and this is part and parcel of the transatlantic bond that will be the focal point of the upcoming meeting in NATO on May 25th. And yes, Jüri, Trump is coming to Brussels. I know that to be a fact. So, but along with actually the new French president, we welcome very much President Macron will be there, and all of the NATO leaders will be there. So long story short, I think that the processes that have driven us together to work closely together in recent years, in fact, if there is that historical conundrum there, it is smoothing out. And I'll give you again one pragmatic example. It was something I should have mentioned at the outset, and that is the way that we are working together in our sea operations, Sea Guardian on the US side and Operation Sophia, the NATO side and Operation Sophia on the EU side to address the migrant flows coming out of North Africa. We've had the operations in the Aegean, bringing NATO and the EU together, again, to keep our finger on the pulse of migrant flows and try to ensure as much orderly handling of those migrant flows as possible. So there are some areas where there are very, very clearly common interests for the EU and NATO. We are actually being driven together in how we are working pragmatically to try to address some important problems for this continent. But nevertheless, I think that if there's been a difference of priorities or a kind of tension there, I really truly believe that it is being smoothed out at this moment.
Do you believe that NATO's increased contribution to Afghanistan is on the cards? I'm asking it based on press releases and stories.
Well, NATO's already considering what to do about the RSM mission, the Resolute Support mission. It was already planned to be continued through 2018, and now we are considering what to do beyond 2018. It has, again, a long history, starting with ISAF, starting with 9/11 and the first invocation of Article 5, but then proceeding now to what is essentially a very well-established and productive training mission for the Afghan armed forces and also Afghan police forces. So I see that there will, my own view is the NATO members will have to decide this, but there seems to be every indication of a willingness to continue on beyond 2018. And we will see, what the debates in Washington and the policy reviews in Washington produce in terms of asks of the NATO allies. But in terms of commitment to resolute support and to being in Afghanistan, I see only continuity.
Thank you. We had a question on the second row.
Hello, Charlie Salonis, Pasternak, Finnish Institute of International Affairs. My question relates to defense industry in a way and its ethical implications. So I accept that it's more than about defense, but considering the EU and NATO, at least to some degree, are also values-based communities, what do you see as the ethical and practical problems with us selling weapons to the Middle East to countries that don't share, never intend to share most of those values? Because we end up having to go and fix them, or we make the problem worse, or take a local grievance conflict and make it effectively a proxy war.
Thank you. I think we had a question down there. Kostya, please. Or who was that? I'm sorry, I don't see your faces very well. So.
Yeah, you're under interrogation lights. I'm Konstantin, I guess. My question is both to Rose and to Nathalie. Herr Brandl said that, forgive me if I quote incorrectly, but the name of the challenge is Vladimir Putin. If you're talking about security and defense cooperation, would you both agree to this statement? Do you think that the EU and NATO see eye to eye on this particular issue, this particular man, and this particular challenge? Thank you.
And we have Bob Norik.
Thank you. My name is Carlos Neritnex, and I represent the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences. I'm a bit surprised of the lack of urgency that I feel in the discussion. We will develop structures, we will develop cooperation regarding defense industry, and we will reach the 2% target somewhere in the future. But at the same time, as the last question also indicated, Mr. Putin is, let's call it, the driving factor behind many of these discussions or actions that we are taking. But Mr. Putin will be dead long before all these things becomes some kind of reality. So I think that
do you have inside information?
Something you'd like to share?
Perhaps we also should discuss short-term actions. And my question then is, do you have any ideas, and that's to the whole panel, what the EU and NATO could do in the short term, let's say the next 2 years, to handle the security situation that is developing in Europe now and in this region? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take Ian from here. Ian Bond.
Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform. Cooperation between the EU and NATO is, of course, extremely important, but cooperation between defence ministries and finance ministries is also hugely important. And it strikes me that almost as big a gap between Evert and the Rond-Point Schuman is the gap between those bits of the machinery that are telling EU countries to cut their public spending and to reduce their deficits and so on, and those ministers who meet at NATO headquarters and agree that we've got to get up to 2%. So my question to both the, as it were, the national and the international representatives is, how do you get to the point where you can put the finance ministries in their place and you can actually get 2% squeezed out of your tax revenues to spend on defence?
Okay, let's take those questions. Let's start from here, Rose. Please.
All right, Konstantin asked, and our Swedish colleague as well, about the challenge posed by Vladimir Putin. I will really underscore, I think, a major point that hasn't come up yet this morning, and that is many NATO members and EU members are the same. And so for NATO members who are also EU members, we are taking already a tremendous, undertaking a tremendous effort springing from decisions made at the Warsaw Summit last summer to have strong deterrence and defense directed at aggressive Russian behavior. This was discussed earlier this morning in a breakfast. Many of you were there, and that did focus in. And so it's a point for our Swedish colleague as well. This is a particular focus on NATO and EU cooperation, but I would say that the countries here in Europe, as well as the countries of North America, are seized by the challenge that is posed by aggressive Russian behavior. And I just went yesterday to the top of base to see what is going on here in Estonia with the battle group taking shape here. And it's very impressive for me to see the UK, Estonian, and French working all together. Soldiers are at the moment exercising in what is the Spring Storm exercise, which is an Estonian exercise, but moving into Sabre Strike in June, which will be a certification exercise for the battle group. And to me, that is an amazing success story to go from Warsaw to the end of June and have 4 battle groups in place, not only here in Estonia, but also Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, with all, practically all NATO countries involved in one way or another, as well as many, many partners. It was impressive for me yesterday seeing some of the command officers who are involved in this activity at the staff level, including partners such as Georgia and Ukraine here in Estonia. It's fantastic the way EFP has brought together both NATO allies and partners across the region to tackle this important security challenge. So I do want to really stress that NATO is doing a lot, and we welcome, of course, cooperation with the EU. But the way I think about NATO-EU cooperation is we each have a set of tools in our toolkit. And it is by bringing the NATO tools and the EU tools together that we, in the end, have a comprehensive package for dealing with all of the challenges that confront us, not only with regard to aggressive Russian behavior, but also with the challenges that are confronting us on a 360-degree basis from the rise of violent extremism. So I think, you know, it's not that we're letting the EU off the hook by any means. I think, again, it's that message that we have a lot to do together, and we are doing it. So just an important point, something we haven't yet discussed today. So the challenge from our Swedish colleague was, do you have any short-term ideas? I would say the short term has been well filled out by the implementation of the decisions coming out of Warsaw.
Nathalie, please.
Okay, so four quick points: values, Putin, money, and EU-NATO. Also to sort of back up what Rose was saying. Values. In the global strategy, we use a term that I'm personally very attached to, which is principled pragmatism. Now, what this doesn't mean and what it means and how it responds to your question. What it does not mean is that the EU should compromise on its values because it has to be pragmatic. What it should mean is that the EU needs to be more realistic in its assessment of the world and therefore more pragmatic in its assessment of the world. And that world is often not a very pretty place. But it has to approach that world, including in security and defense terms, by living up to its own values. More than imposing its values on others, living up to its own values, and we have a bit of homework to do internally as well in that respect. I think the notion that we use in the global strategy, which is also part of the NATO vocabulary, is actually resonates quite a lot, which is resilience. The idea of resilience is that we're not simply propping up the state security and defense sort of structures of our partners, but we also work on societal resilience, which goes from the politics to the economy, to climate, to energy. So it's a much broader approach to resilience. Putin, I start where Rose started as well. It would be a bit odd if there was a completely different view in the EU and NATO, considering that 22 are the same member states. Slightly schizophrenic if they say one thing in one context and quite another in another. Having said that, it's clear that we're talking about different animals, and that therefore, in a NATO context, the security and defense angle on Russia is going to be the same as the security and defense angle within the European Union. But the European Union includes other policy areas which NATO does not cover. And so obviously the sort of vantage point is going to be slightly different when we're talking about how to engage with Russian society. There's the old visa liberalization debate. When we talk about cooperation in areas such as whatever, infrastructure or research. So it's obvious that the range of issues is much broader, and therefore the approach may be slightly different, but not because the security and defense lens on Putin is different. That has to be the same. Otherwise, it'd be completely schizophrenic. Money, of course, there is an internal, if you like, issue within member states between finance ministers and defense ministries, and we know that. I think from an EU sort of perspective, the fact that and it has been, and it still is in some respects, a sort of controversial idea to put on the table, but the fact that the European Defence Action Plan did float the fact that cooperative defence spending would be exempt from the Stability Pact rule does go in the direction of providing greater incentives for member states to spend on defence and spend together in a way which is compatible with their obligations on the finance side. Last point on EU-NATO, and I come back to a point that Rose made at the very beginning of her intervention, which is referring back to the title of this panel. Indeed, not only is there not, and there cannot be, more EU means less NATO, so that not only is it a false proposition, I would argue that more EU is the only way to have more NATO, if we think about it in terms of capability and capability development. And more EU is the only way to have more EU and NATO. The more the EU does, the more space there is to cooperate and coordinate with NATO.
I get that. For me, it a bit still proves the point that there are enormous assets the EU can bring to bear in solving crises outside its perimeter. But when we talk about defense, that is really not the best asset the EU has. Now, it might develop into an excellent asset, but it is not necessarily at the moment. So we sort of sell ourselves short on other projects we can do, at the same time sort of pumping to our chest, if you will, on we want to be a defense union. This is a very personal view, but you know, we have to recognize the realistic possibilities of the European Union. I think that's extremely important. But sorry, Reinhard.
I would like to make 3 points. The first point is on the 2% discussion. We should be careful in this discussion because the aim is not to spend more, only to spend more money. Or in other words, spending money is not an aim by itself.
Right.
And if we discuss it in such a way, either not our finance minister will not accept it, and our public will not accept it. So the aim for us is, and that's a challenge, is to define projects that are reasonable to make our armed forces more efficient and stronger. And that's the challenge for us at the moment. And it's foreseeable that requires more money. And we do not argue with the finance minister about the money in 2024. We argue with the finance minister for the money in 2018. And therefore, we have to present reasonable concepts. And that's our challenge, and that's our work at the moment. First point. Second point is on Putin. I didn't say Putin is the reason. I said Putin is the driver. The reason is why we should invest more in national capabilities, but also in capabilities at EU and NATO level. The reason is that there are various threats of our security threats in the future for European and national security. E.g., for instance, terrorism is one threat. Also migration, we don't know how this will develop. We have failed states in Africa, really very different and very different threat. But what Putin has done, it remembered us that security is not automatically given, it's at risk. And for instance, we have, it's a reason why we are in Lithuania with 1 battalion. And and in German armed forces, there's sometimes a joke if something is financed, which was not possible a few years ago, they say, thank you, Putin. So that's why I'm arguing this, but our focus is not only Russia, our focus is broader, and investing in armed forces, investing in material helps us for various security threats. We cannot foresee how they will, but I think there will be some in the future. And the third point I would like to make is the question on weapons export. Weapon export is always a political decision, and there is no easy or moral correct yes or no. So what we are doing and what the German government is doing is we look at each case, country, and weapon system, and there are less critical situations and decision situations, and there are more critical decision situations. And if pros and cons said no, the risk is too high, that it's more security risks than it provides security, then the government says no, it's right and it's fully correct. The challenge we have is the harmonization of these decisions. Because within multinational corporations, only 10%, for instance, is built in France, and 5% in Italy, and X% in Germany and the US. And I think the decision on whether it's exportable or not should be harmonized between the country. And that's a challenge we have.
Thank you. Etienne.
Okay, just I'll try and be quick. On ethical issues, I fully subscribe to what has just been said. We also have a fairly robust system of control. And let me point out, when you look at casualties, and especially civilian casualties across the world, you will realize that 90, if not 98% of that is caused by small arms. Kalashnikov and mortars and landmines, mostly, okay? So it doesn't mean that we should not pay attention, and we do pay attention, and believe me, it's quite complicated actually to export a weapon system. You have lots of checks within the system, so you don't, talk to someone on the industry and they tell you that really we are a pain to them. So it's very different from what some people assume. And here again, it's a political decision. I also fully subscribe to what Rose said. I think on the short-term aspect, EFP has really been a credible answer, and I'm also quite amazed that we did what we did in such a short period of time. It's quite an accomplishment, I think. Now, as a Frenchman, I would also add that deterrence has always been there. We've always maintained deterrence. For us, it's a permanent mission, nuclear deterrence. And it was there before, it's still there today, and will be there tomorrow. Even though it was a subject that most in the EU, among our EU partners, were not very keen on discussing a few years ago. It's important here as well that we have a modicum of unity on that issue. So it goes beyond, if you want, purely military considerations. And on urgency as well, here again, it's not just about the eastern flank. We should all be very clear in our minds as to the fact that Daesh, whatever happens in the next few weeks and few months, and even if we terminate the pseudo-caliphate as a territorial entity, Daesh as a terrorist organization is not going away. Right. And Al-Qaeda is still there, and Al-Qaeda in Yemen is fairly active and extremely dangerous. So, the terrorism problem is as urgent, and to some degree even more urgent, and will need also to be addressed, and not just now, not just in the Levant, but everywhere, 360 degrees, including internally, and for many years, I'm afraid. So we fully subscribe to your sense of urgency, but urgency is here. Urgency, as we discussed this morning in the breakfast session, is also, or was, in the North Atlantic and in the north, and urgency is in the Levant, and urgency is in the Sahel region. So we have to deal with all those urgencies at the same time, which is fairly problematic, and of course brings me to the third point, budgets. I'm quite willing to take any suggestion as to how better wage that bureaucratic battle. It's difficult, obviously. I think something that has not been said enough of late is the fact that proper defense investments, industrial investments, equipment, actually has a positive effect on growth. It's something that has been really lost in our discussions in the past 10 or 15 years, which is why I made my earlier point about the cross benefits between the civilian and the defense industry. It's very important that people realize that. So hopefully my country is already quite close to 2%. Here again, you're right, it's not just about numbers, it's how you spend it, and especially whether you buy the right kind of capabilities, the right kind of equipment. But frankly speaking, there is a wide disparity in Europe today. And I can say that with a lot of comfort, because Estonia is certainly a good model for everyone, but not everyone in Europe is where Estonia is. So just by bringing everyone closer to that target, of course it's artificial, but it's a good political way of raising awareness and of bringing everyone in the right direction. But it will take time. And again, I repeat my earlier point, and you know that perfectly, but between the moment you spend more, the moment you buy the capabilities you need, and the moment you fill them and they are operational, it takes years and sometimes even decades. So that's a fact.
I think you raise an important point about the importance of the southern flank. And we in Estonia have always emphasized that while we very much appreciate what allies do for us, we are certainly ready to participate in any way or form in southern flank operations. I think we are facing an intellectual problem here, which is that in our region, it's clear. You bring the troops here, you show the flag, you show the tanks. It's kind of a more or less Cold War-like light style situation. I'm simplifying, of course. But in the south, the question is, what can we do? I mean, especially in terms of military. I mean, what would be the role of the military in trying to help Libya or, you know, trying to solve the terrorist challenges? I think there we need much more kind of the intellectual, in-depth analysis. What could be our added value in the southern flank? I don't suppose anybody would be opposing your argument that we should do more in the south. But sometimes the question is, what exactly should we do? Yeah. Oh, we have 10 minutes, so I'll take 2 more questions and let them be pointed ones, so to say. Please.
Thank you. I'm Anna Wislander with the Atlantic Council, and I thought of a pointed question now that EU defense is all back with some energy. We had a flagship project called the EU battle groups way back, and what are the lessons learned? They were supposed to be the muscle, the readiness to facilitate decision-making and for the EU to act, but they were hardly ever used. So what can we learn from that now that we are moving into more of EU defense and security cooperation again? Thank you.
And there was a question in the same row, please.
My name is Jana Poljerin, and I work for the German Council on Foreign Relations. And I was just wondering if we would have had this discussion, let's say in January, I think the name Donald Trump and the American commitment would have been much more a problem than it seems to be during this discussion, because nobody has kind of questioned the American commitment to NATO, has addressed the Trump problem, the obvious elephant in the room. And I was just wondering if I was the only one in the room who was still not so sure about the American commitment and about the future. So the title, More EU, Less NATO, I think, or I guess when it was thought about, meant maybe also that the EU had to do more because less NATO was not kind of a choice we had, but a choice made by the United States. Could you comment on that? Thank you.
Okay. I'll take one more, and then we'll wrap it up, please.
I have a very specific question. Basically, if we are speaking that the EU and NATO will have the same threat perception, I would be very worried, because if I look specifically into the topic of Russian subversion and disinformation, the EU's response in the institutions has been almost non-existent. In March 2015, we had the European Council conclusions, so many other resolutions since then. Today, we have only 11 people working in the EIS, most of them paid only by the member states. So my question is, basically, will the EU institutions ever take seriously Russian disinformation? Because to finish up on this, we have already 13 out of EU 28 countries which are already participating in the E-Stratcom, in the COE in Riga, or in the new Finnish Center of Excellence. So 13 countries, not only the Baltics, but still in Brussels it's still not seen as important.
Thank you. And please, the final comments. Let's start from
All right, I can be quick. I think most appropriate, or maybe not appropriate, for me to comment on the American commitment. I think clearly during his election campaign, Mr. Trump had some worries very clearly expressed about NATO being obsolete and about NATO allies not paying their share. I think one of the reasons, frankly, why this debate has dissipated somewhat is because the administration, including Mr. Trump, have begun to speak more decisively about the value of NATO and the importance of NATO going forward. Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, was in Washington last month, and during the press conference with Mr. Trump said very, very clearly, NATO is not obsolete. well, of course, cheers went up in the corridors of the NATO headquarters, but I think around that has been the establishment of a very, very serious and focused team, starting with Secretary of Defense Mattis, whom we saw in NATO very early in the administration during our February Defense Ministerial, all, again, speaking with one voice about the importance of NATO to transatlantic security and, in the end, the security of the United States of America. So I do think the debate has dissipated somewhat, but I do think that the May 25th leaders meeting, the meeting of heads of state and government, is going to be very, very important for cementing that commitment in this administration to NATO. And I have every reason to believe our preparations have gone very well. We will be focusing on the burden sharing issue as well as on the fight against terrorism, with, again, this overarching theme of the transatlantic bond, cementing the two together. So I have every reason to believe the meeting will go well, but it's going to be worth watching. So tune in on the 25th.
Excellent. Nathalie.
Okay, so BGs and Stratcom, battle groups. Well, this year is the 10th anniversary of the battle groups. It's not true that the battle groups have rarely been used. The battle groups have never been used. Now, I think 10 years, it's time to face the issue head on. What are the problems? I think there are three sets of problems. There are conceptual problems, if you like, the concept of the battle group. Does it work? There are political will problems, and there are financial problems. Actually, those three sets of problems are tightly interconnected to one another. I think time has come this year to put those three problems on the table, to have a frank discussion about them, to see whether we can settle them within the existing, if you like, framework of the battle groups. And it may be that we fail. It may be that we fail, and in which case, obviously, there will still be a need for rapid response. We do have a PESCO conversation which is ongoing. That may be a framework within which to, if you like, re-import a different concept of the battle groups with different financial arrangements, with a different degree of political will. I don't know which of those two options we're going to go for. What I do know is that in order to make that choice, we need to really be very frank about what the situation is and what the problems are today. Stratcom. On this, my view is that it's slightly unfair to simply put and point the finger towards the EAS on this. I mean, the EAS at the end of the day is, to be honest, a fairly small outfit in the Brussels jungle. Yes, we're all happy and we applaud that Stratcom is now part of what the EAS should be doing, and I agree it should be doing more. But to me, the real issue is question mark, what does the Commission do about this? There is a whole DG Com in the Commission. This is not a couple of people. These are hundreds of people. Now we know, after France, now with Germany, that the kind of disinformation problems that we have are not actually an Eastern problem. They are a Europe-wide, a transatlantic issue. And therefore, the Commission that does work on these internal issues and has hundreds of people working on them, surely this should be part of their mandate. I think the debate is only just starting, to be honest, but I think that is where we have to look for, not just the EAS, which will continue to be a fairly small outfit. Yes, we can pump it up a bit more, but there's a lot of resources elsewhere in that town that should be devoted to this issue.
Thanks. Fred.
I would like to make a small point on Donald Trump. And yes, you are right, America's commitment is decisive for NATO and it's decisive for European security. When it comes to 2%, from my perspective, the American position hadn't changed. Although administrations before pointed on that issue, perhaps Donald Trump makes it a little bit louder than administrations before, but the position at that point had not changed. When it comes to the commitment and its position on NATO, to be honest, our problem is we cannot really foresee how American politics and Americans' position will develop in the next months and in the next years. So we only can wait and see it, because we cannot influence it. From our point of view, we can wait and see and have to react on these developments.
Yeah, I fully concur with that too. US disengagement, if it were to materialize suddenly, would do so most probably because some kind of huge shock, whether a war in Asia or an urgent contingency somewhere. This is not what we're talking about, because obviously we couldn't do much about it, and the US neither. What we're talking about is just the fact that the US has a lot on its plate. They have to take care of many responsibilities at the same time, so it's only high time that we stepped up. And the French have been making that case for a long time now. It's not just Trump. Remember Obama leading from behind. So we have to prepare for a less prominent US role in European security writ large, which doesn't mean that the US will leave. I don't think they will, frankly speaking. But it means that we need to take our own security more seriously as Europeans, whatever the venue. EU, NATO, bilateral. So I rephrase that. I'll repeat it once more. We have to be pragmatic and use whatever venue that actually delivers greater security for all of Europe. That's really what matters. And if we do that, we will also show the US that we are a very serious partner, because taking care of European security problems, which are quite large, even geographically, actually means that we have also some capabilities for contingencies beyond, which is what the French and the British have tried to preserve over the years. And that is, of course, of interest to the US as well. So that's what we need to do.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me tell you a quick joke, and then we'll wrap it up. Discussing the financing on defense, and I remembered Ian's point about the finance ministry being the biggest enemy of the defense ministry. Lord Robertson told me a story when he went to visit, as British Secretary of Defense, he went to visit an Arab country. And there was a very distinguished meeting with the defense minister of that country. But the defense ministry at the final sort of instance has fallen ill. And so he was sitting in front of somebody who he thought is the defense minister and started to make these Scottish jokes about, you know, the finance minister is the biggest enemy of the defense ministry. And then the guy said with very sour face, well, I am the finance minister. So, we'll wrap it up here. Please join me to thank the panel. We have addressed a very complicated issue in a very comprehensive manner. So this meeting is adjourned.